Welcome to Celebrity Interviews with Paul. I have with me Representative Padma Kuppa. Padma is the Michigan State Representative for the 41st District, which covers Troy and Clawson in Michigan. And I know that of all of her great accomplishments and accolades, she is most proud that in 2019, on Thanksgiving Day, she was the starter for the Mighty Gobbler 5K. Welcome, Representative Kuppa.
Very nice to be here, Paul. I'm really honored to be able to speak with you and to just share some thoughts about where we are today in the world.
Well, as we were preparing for this, you mentioned you're in your basement and you're expecting sounds overhead because your daughter's working on meal preparation. And I guess that's kind of a lead in to say, how is life in the pandemic different and treating you these days?
Well, both kids came home. They're both in their early 20s. She finished college and went on to med school and finished 2 years of med school, and has come home during the pandemic to work at a local women's health clinic. My son is in his undergraduate degree at Michigan State, and he is home. And we are looking to what happens next because Michigan State is welcoming their students back onto the college campus. And so he will be living back in East Lansing come August. So it will be interesting.
Yeah, I have a college student in my family as well, and reading what Wittenberg University in Ohio is planning to do is it's interesting and a little anxiety provoking, and the idea of expecting college students to socially distance over an extended period of time is kind of a reach.
Right. So the kids are doing well. My husband has been working from home, as have I. I think my job, contrary to some people's expectations, even though we haven't been in Lansing that much, my staff are working additional hours, as am I, trying to help provide the resources that are available through the Michigan website, through the state websites, as various state websites, and also through the county information and the federal government Paycheck Protection Program to local small businesses, and make sure that they all understand and connect with the right information. Our biggest challenge has been our social safety nets not being in place for a pandemic. Right? Most social safety nets are there, but even before the pandemic, the unemployment UIA, Unemployment Insurance Agency, was taking 2 to 3 weeks to process an unemployment claim.
That's a long time. And that was before, and then in the middle of it.
And the systems, and I come from with an IT and engineering background, we didn't have the capacity to take the number of people that were being furloughed and asked to file for unemployment. And so the systems, the hardware systems, the software systems weren't prepared for that kind of onslaught, on top of which the adjudication process itself was almost like, we don't believe people are working and we don't believe people really need help sometimes. Mm-hmm. And but so we're going to make them screw the thumbs. You know, when I was laid off in 2008, and I remember I was so embarrassed that they let go of me and then I had to ask for help. But I think we need to look at it as that is asking for help. It's a hand up so that we don't forego our mortgage payment or our car payment, because that helps the economy. We're not saying we're going to give it to you forever. It's for a brief period of time so that everybody is healthy and safe, because government's job is to keep people healthy and safe.
It does seem sometimes like, and I've talked to some people who've gone through the unemployment process during all this, and it seems like sometimes the system was set up to catch everybody who might ever create any kind of hint of fraud. And when you do that, you make it really, really difficult to get money to people that have legitimate applications to make and things like that. So yeah, it is, and it's almost as though it was a system designed to be difficult.
Very much.
Yeah. We were, and then I didn't realize that unemployment benefits are taxed, and I thought, really? We have to pay taxes, income taxes, on unemployment benefits? But it is what it is. So.
I know there's so many things that I came in because to run for office because I felt every child deserves an education. Because to me, it's about giving a man an education is like teaching a man to fish.
Right.
Right.
Give them resources, and then people can do better. Yep.
Right. And so providing that basic level of education. And I also understood that not everyone comes from an equal platform. So, and I'll give you a really simple example. I'm an engineer. My husband's an engineer. My kids had problems with calculus homework. We could help.
Right.
A lot of people can't say that. My daughter had biology questions. Don't ask me. Knew nothing about it. Didn't want anything to know about it. That's why I went to college.
I was an English major, not too helpful with calculus, but I can write you a paper.
Exactly. So those are simple ways of understanding education. Everybody's going to come with their own sets of privilege, whatever that privilege looks like. But the bottom line is every child should feel safe. Every child should have a full belly, should not be hungry, right? And that is the precursor to even getting an education. If a child is not safe and does not feel safe, and if a child does not have health, whether it's in terms of food security or water or whatever, those things, that child is not going to be able to get a good education. And so we need to level that first and make sure every child comes to school fed with water and resources to live, certain life, and then they can learn.
Well, it's a reminder that, you start off saying, well, let's get better. What if we just get better schools? But that's just the beginning, or even just part of a much more complex interwoven thing, because then you get into issues of justice, issues of poverty, issues of opportunities, and all kinds of, and then we add like the opioid issues in the midst of all that. All those things interwove into worrying about how we lift up all people and all that. It's not like you pass one bill in Lansing and you go, whoa, we're done, we're good. It's a lot more than that.
No, it's not. And that actually, I don't know if you want me to kind of jump into some legislation issues, but
sure, go for it.
I went into Lansing really rosy-eyed that I'm going to do things the way I do in the interfaith space, which, I've been a huge advocate for interfaith understanding. Because at the end of the day, if we don't learn to treat each other as our common humanity and see our common humanity, we can't see the challenges that you face or that I face, because everybody faces challenges. As we using Christian imagery, everybody has a cross to bear.
Yeah, there you go.
And so I went in there thinking everybody wants to solve problems for all people. Maybe we have different ways of looking at it. And so my first bill was actually about protecting a vulnerable adult. So we have all these laws about online sexual predators, making sure that no child is a victim of sexual predators online. And so we don't have all the laws corrected because a lot of these laws were written before technology. And so some of these laws that we're fixing do not also address adults. So if you have a vulnerable adult, somebody who has autism, someone who has Down syndrome, and so unless people come forward and show that information and are willing to share that story, so then you can turn that into a law, you can't close those loopholes. So we had a family in Troy that was willing to share their story at great pain to themselves. And my predecessor actually introduced a bill, and he said, I really couldn't finish it because it was towards the end of my term. Look at my bill, see which one, you want to introduce. You're free. And I was actually allowed to introduce 10 bills in that first month, in December, as soon as I got sworn in. And so this was the first bill I picked because I could relate to this. A vulnerable adult, somebody in my family has autism, and just, I can't imagine what will happen when that child who's now 13 or 14 becomes an adult. Who's going to protect? And so the law has to be, more robust. And so let's close this loophole. It's a real simple example. Took it to Lansing, introduced it, actually went across the aisle. My first co-sponsors were the people who co-sponsored it the last time when Martin Harrelak introduced it.
Okay.
I said, okay, because they told me when I came in, they're like, Padma, it's not going to be easy. You're a Democrat in a district that's never been held by a by somebody like you. And so I went across the aisle. Eric Lloyd Heuser, Brana Kale, Steve Marino, all of them signed it. And I had some friends who I made during orientation when we got training. Mike Mueller, he's a former deputy sheriff in Linden. He signed it, co-sponsored it. And then a bunch of my colleagues on the Democratic caucus signed it. Wouldn't get a hearing. Could not get a hearing. Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill. I don't know if you remember watching that.
Yeah, and then it dies by lack of a second. Yep.
Yeah, so basically it's been sitting, it got a hearing. I did convince Kathy Crawford, who is the representative from Novi, who I knew through some of the other work that I'd been doing. And I said, please, can you give it a hearing? And she and her committee approved it unanimously. So it went to the second committee. It's been there for a year. And so legislation isn't that easy. Right.
Yeah, even when you get support across the aisle, all that bipartisan support, it still gets stuck. Well, you're talking from your basement because we are in the midst of a pandemic, and the state obviously is doing a lot to respond to it. You talked about some of the things your office is specifically doing. What do you think the state needs to do as we try and balance the public health crisis that we're in the midst of? And particularly Michigan was our numbers were so high early on. It was horrifying. How do we balance that with, obviously, we can't live in our houses forever, and people are already starting to move about. So what do you see us needing to do as we move into the future?
So the information changes daily, as you know, based on the numbers. But I do think that the numbers for Michigan are really good right now. We are right now the #1 state in controlling COVID in new cases. And the way that we're reopening has been done in a very smart way. And I'm waiting to hear what is the way that the schools and the colleges reopen.
Yeah.
I think that's one big thing. I think the second big thing is how we manage our state budget. Because without help from the federal government, a lot of the companies would not have survived these last few months. Even with furloughs, my husband got a furlough. Many friends in the automotive industry, because I used to work there, many of them have seen pay cuts.
Yep.
But they're still able to stay in their job, stay in their home, and cut down, but still manage. Right. But I think that how we figure out the state budget without funding for schools and colleges is going to be a big problem.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge.
So there is a limitation in the state budget in that we must be a balanced budget. Most states have this, but Michigan in particular, we have to have a balanced budget. So you cannot spend money you do not have. Now, I will say with the federal government, they were able to provide that CARES Act money. And what that did was it allowed us to put that money back into the economy. Because if you give me a paycheck or an unemployment check or a stimulus check, or you give me money to pay payroll through the Paycheck Protection Program, which is what the CARES Act did, all of that is going to buy groceries to keep the economy going.
Yep.
But I don't know about the next piece of it and how we will do it. And that has become somewhat of a partisan issue as well. And I'm very concerned because we'll be hit for generations. We have something called the Consensus Revenue Estimating Committee or Conference, which is where the Senate and the House and the appropriations teams get together with the House Fiscal Agency and the Senate Fiscal Agency. These are two nonpartisan organizations that exist no matter who's in office. They have been there. Right. They have the bean counters for the state. And they helped do a conference. They did a conference about a month and a half ago, and they said what we have. And they don't really have a firm number because we don't have income taxes being filed until July 15th.
Right. That all got delayed. That's really helpful, isn't it, for planning out when you don't know how much money is coming in. Right.
So we are probably going to not be looking at a state budget that we can plan until after July 15th. So we will probably be going back in July. We have to finish it before October 1st. We did that last year. We will do that again, hopefully sooner than October 1st. But we need
But
those
with
numbers.
obviously cuts to revenue for the state, you're going to anticipate some kind of changes in services and things and supplies and kinds of things the government does.
Yes.
So as we try and look towards like managing the pandemic, because obviously we're in a situation where we're still in the midst of it. Our numbers look great in Michigan, but the disease is still present. It's still in the community and will be for the foreseeable future, at least months to come, I would think. What do we as individuals, what can we do to help and make a difference? And what is our responsibility?
Yeah, so I would say first, not being unsafe. So, we have guidelines on the coronavirus, michigan.gov/coronavirus. There are best practices. So wearing a mask, it's not a political statement. It should not be a political statement. It should be a statement of caring.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something that we in the Democratic caucus have really been stressing, that we see some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle that are not willing to make that concession. And so it's really sad because we have a lot of people in the Democratic caucus and in the chambers who are vulnerable. And
I don't have a lot of patience with non-mask wearing, because it's particularly, in the Christian tradition, Jesus tells us to do two things. He tells us to love God and love our neighbor. And everything I read about mask wearing or face covering suggests that it doesn't really protect me as much as it protects you from whatever I have. And so if we're supposed to love our neighbor, it seems to me that wearing a mask or a face covering is about the least you could do. But
yes, I want to ask you, since I'm here, one of my favorite verses that actually set me on this path was Mark 12:31.
Mm-hmm. Uh-oh. Am I supposed to know that off the top of my head, Padma?
Love thy neighbor as thyself.
Love thy neighbor. That's right. Right. Well, they asked him, what are the two most important commandments? He says, love God and love your neighbor. Yep.
Yeah. And he quotes from Deuteronomy and Leviticus. So just a small aside, when I got into this interfaith situation, I guess, in 2005, when we formed the Troy area interfaith group. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, I did active interfaith work, building bridges across religious diversity for a number of years. And it was sort of, in addition to raising my family and working, this is sort of my other big passion. I call it my passion for pluralism. And when I saw the challenges to public education in 2017, mm-hmm. People had been asking me to run for office, to run for something for a number mm-hmm. of years. And I was watching everything at the national level unfold. And I realized that things really have to start at home. Like they say, charity begins at home.
Yep.
And so rather than worry about what was happening on the national stage, because it was not something I could really figure out or fix or even understand some days, yep. Like why the venom, right? I just don't understand. And so I was thinking that my son had graduated high school, was just starting college. And I was thinking, what do I do next? This is just, I'm not able to contend with the hatred and the vitriol in the world. Let me go to seminary. And by the time he finishes his degree, by the time my daughter finishes her med school degree, I will finish a degree in theology. And I will be better at interfaith by doing this degree in theology, and I can leave the automotive, IT, finance world and do this as my later life career.
Yeah.
And so I started on that path, and I took one class that semester because I had a lot of other commitments. I was also looking at, do I run for office? Do I run? What do I run for? How do I make a change? Right. Everything pointed to the state house. So I'm making conversations, talking to people, learning how do you run a campaign. I'd never run for anything. Last time I ran for something was 8th grade Latin club president.
Did you win?
I won.
Oh, there you go. See, you got a history.
So, yeah, I have 2 on 2 now. I can say I won Latin club president. And I won state rep. But so when I took the class, the only class that fit my schedule was a class on Gospel of Mark. And my friend Bob Cornwall gave me some books. My friend Reverend Charlotte Summers, who retired from Northminster, gave me some books in her in her garage. And so
Sure.
I bought a couple, and I was doing the form to fill out the candidate committee to be a candidate.
Yeah.
And the same day I decided, you know what, I can't do all this. Let me take a day off from work. Took a day off, filled out my form to make sure I got all the I's dotted and all the T's crossed. And I also had a reflection to do on chapter 12
Mm-hmm.
of Gospel of Mark. Boy, did that speak to me, because the whole issue is Jesus goes back to the mount, to the temple, and they're all asking him questions. I mean, there was even a question about taxes in that chapter.
Yep. Yep.
You know, and he says, give to God what is God's, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's.
Right.
And he says, like you said, love God and yourself. That's the most important commandment. And the scribe is the one who asks him, what's the second most? And he quotes from Leviticus and Deuteronomy.
Mm-hmm.
And at the very end of that chapter, he says the widow, he then tells them, why is the widow, or asks them, why is the widow paying more than her fair share? And we were signing our federal tax law into a federal tax act into law, the one in 2017 at that time. And I was like, this is it. This is why I'm going to run for office, because everybody should be paying their fair share.
Mm-hmm.
And we should love our neighbor. And that's really, you know, whether the neighbor is across the street or across the city or across the state, you know, I think it's
Yeah.
your neighbor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How about that word speaking to you? That's awesome. That's a beautiful story, Padma. Thank you for sharing that. Well, so obviously, we've had protests recently with the killing of George Floyd. The Black Lives Matter movement had a huge resurgence. We even had a protest march down 16 Mile Road, right in front of Somerset Collection in Troy, and a number of other things. And there's all kinds of talk about how we deal with police. You know, what kind of restrictions we need to place on police, what kind of legislations we need. Can you speak a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement, those protests, and what you see coming out of that?
Sure. First, I want to say, so my journey in understanding all this actually started with volunteering in the city right after 9/11, which is really interesting that this is the journey, right? So 9/11 happened. I saw how people were being racially profiled while flying. I was like, okay, so that then led to being involved with the city board called Ethnic Issues Advisory Board. From the city board, I then went on to meet people and start the Troy Interfaith Group.
Mm-hmm.
The organization that helped me is an organization known as the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
And in 2015, when my son graduated from high school and I was shuffling, I was no longer on PTA, I decided I would become actively involved on the board of the Roundtable.
Okay.
And so I'd been working with them, and a lot of what they do is around ending systemic inequities. And one of the big projects they worked on was an exhibit on redlining and how state level policy and federal level policy has prevented African Americans from living in certain areas and having access to the same things that I, as an immigrant, have, for example.
Right.
And so I became a member of the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus. The current mayor, Flint, was a former state representative, and he was the chair of the Michigan Legislative Black Caucus. And he said, we want to invite all people of color. This isn't just about Black experience, but also what other people of color bring to the table. And he invited me in. Awesome. Leslie Love, who is a state representative in her third term in Detroit, then said, Padma loves history, because she'd come door knocking for me here in Troy.
Yeah.
And I am the president of the Troy Historical Society over at 17 and Livernois. You know, there's that. So I became the historian for the Legislative Black Caucus and have been actually charting the history of the MLBC in the Capitol, and like who has been doing what and what have they done. Now, I don't know if you know, there's never the first African American in the state legislature was a Republican in 1896, William Henry Ferguson, and his painting hangs in the Capitol.
Awesome.
So if you ever at the state capitol, if you ever want to come visit me and spend a day, I will take you to see his portrait. But I knew that policy is what needs changing.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's police brutality, or training for police, or the support services that the police are looking for. So I don't know if you
Mm-hmm.
know who Chief Nastasi is here in Troy.
Mm-mm.
He's the police chief. So when I first started volunteering in Troy in 2002, I met him. He was an officer here.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen other police chiefs come and retire. And Frank is now the newest police chief. And he and I met at the Oakland County Sheriff, Mike Bouchard, has an event once a quarter with all the state legislators and all the PDs from across Oakland County. And so it was really funny. I went into my last meeting that we had before the pandemic, and the Republicans are on one side, a bunch of police people on this side, a bunch of men in uniform on that side, and there's a few Democrats over there. Troy PD has, unfortunately, there's nobody from Clawson there that day, but Frank was there, and he had a seat next to him, and he kind of like motioned me over. So here I am sitting next to the Troy police chief. And so we started talking while we were there. As we were listening, we were whispering to each other as the meeting was going on. And he brought up to me the fact that they really wish they had social workers. Because a lot of the visits they make, because actually it came up because I talked to him. I was knocking doors last summer, even though I like talking to neighbors. I like to hear what people have to say. You wouldn't think that right now, but I would go knock on doors and make sure people knew what I'm doing in the legislature, and am I still working on the right things? I'm working on education, I'm working on environment, and making sure everybody has access to clean water. Is there something else? Right? And so I was knocking on doors, and I knocked on a door last summer of a man who was much, much, much older, and he was alone. And just emanating from the house was a bad smell.
Mm-hmm.
And I discovered that I can call the non-emergency hotline for the police, and they will send somebody out to do a wellness check.
Yeah.
But the thing is, as Frank pointed out, as Chief Nastasi pointed out, they are not trained. They're trained in law enforcement.
Right. Yeah, that's a social worker job, not a police officer job. Yep.
And so, we've cut so many of these social services because we've created, I don't know if you've ever seen, I don't know, there's a pastor that showed me this once. His name is Rich Peacock. He's retired now. He's a United Methodist pastor. And I actually have to go up and look for my Frisbee. I was telling one of my colleagues about it. It's a circle with which slices of the pie go to what.
Sure.
And 60% of our federal budget goes to military.
Right.
6% goes to education.
Yeah, and we do things to cut off our nose to spite our face because we're really good at funding prisons, and we're really good at putting people incarcerating people for drug offenses and stuff. We're only now starting to get a little bit better at providing like drug rehabilitation programs and some of those kind of things.
Well, did you know that Troy does not have a tank? But guess what? Ann Arbor has a tank. The city of Taylor has 2 tanks. Talking to my colleagues who know what's going on in their own communities, we're comparing notes. And I'm like, somebody should have a database of which police departments have tanks. Why does a police department need a tank?
Because they were giving them away after the war. They were dirt cheap. They had to take them. Yeah, I know. So are there specific reforms that you think we should enact?
Yeah, so there's a fantastic task force. So the governor has been really good at putting different task forces together since she came to office. One task force that she has is called the Pretrial Incarceration Task Force. So they were looking at criminal justice reform. It was led by Chief Justice McCormick and Garland Gilchrist, our lieutenant governor, who himself experienced police bias.
Sure.
And so the 2 of them and one of my colleagues who I absolutely adore, her name is Tanisha Yancey. So when Tanisha was young, she got in trouble with the law for shoplifting or something like that. She went on to graduate college, graduate law school, and is now a legislator. So that experience that she brings, that compassion, that personal story that she
Yeah.
has, and she's from Detroit. She also covers some parts of Grosse Pointe, so
Hmm.
she's got quite a varied neighborhood.
Hmm.
And so she is in that task force as well, and they came up with a series of fantastic recommendations, which they're now turning into policy, and it's bipartisan, which I think is really fantastic, because a lot of the different stakeholders, the prosecuting attorneys, the police officers, I had two police officers, one from Troy, one from Clawson, come to stay with me on September 11th when we were commemorating 9/11 last year. And I asked them, what is the thing that you want me to do the most? Like, what is the
Hmm.
one thing? And the
Sure.
takeaway I got from them was, please don't ask us to enforce laws that are impossible to enforce. Like, enact laws that we can enforce. And
Right.
don't give us, and this is the same thing the teachers say, don't give us laws that without funding it. Right?
Right. Right.
Unfunded mandates are the hardest thing, because it just
Sure.
adds on to people's jobs. And
But in the midst of all this movement, I hear conversations like about making June 19th the national holiday and things like that. But in some ways, like that would be a great thing. But it's like the easy way out. It's not very painful to create another holiday, and it doesn't really change people's lives in a significant way. It's a message we can get out, but it's that legislation that works on removing the restrictions, that the limitations to education and housing and the criminal justice reform and all those kind of things that really are going to, in the long run, make an impact.
right. So this week we do have another criminal justice reform package coming out. We already had one. We have another one, and that is one of the reasons that my bill, Justice for Allie, the
Yeah.
vulnerable adult online sexual predator bill, is one of the reasons that they've given me that it hasn't seen the light at the end of the tunnel, is because they're working on so much criminal justice reform.
Sure.
We did raise the age. Michigan was the last state to raise the age. So now a 17-year-old is no longer tried as an adult, which I think
Okay.
is a huge issue.
Yeah.
We are also working on, Michigan has an average of how long a person stays in jail, 54 months, compared to the national average, which is 30 months.
Ooh, that's
That's
not good.
expensive, in addition
Yeah.
to hurting people, right? I
Right.
want to protect people. If I want to protect people and be fiscally responsible, that's something that we should address. What is it that we're doing differently? And
Hmm.
so one of the examples is, like, when a person has mental health issues, are we addressing that before we put them in jail? Are we looking at where that might have been the reason that they were included? Maybe they were an accessory to a crime, and the crime that they originally an accessory to was something that would not have been as big, but because the person leading that criminal effort committed a murder, now they're being charged with murder, but actually that person only committed to doing the robbery, not the murder, right? So
Right.
how do we make sure that the sentencing and the framing of a crime is appropriate, and so that the penalty is also appropriate?
Well, and then the other thing, I have a colleague that my youth worker is also developing a church in Pontiac, and in that context, he talks about one of the financial traps that people get into, between court fees and DUI fees that involve having to pay for testing and all this kind of stuff. And so next thing you know, you get into this spiral where you're constantly in debt to the court, in one way
Right.
or
That
another.
is
And
that is
and
one
then
of the that is one of the number one things that Tanisha was talking about, Representative Yancey was talking about, which is when you don't have a driver's license, when
right,
your license is expired, when you have fees that you need to pay because of tickets or speeding tickets, or even stationary, like non-driving
sure,
violations.
parking tickets or something like that.
Right. So what do you do when you can't afford to pay those? And so making sure that people are not put in jail for those.
Right.
And then obviously auto insurance. And I'm not sure that we did the
Oof.
full thing that we could have on auto insurance. I think that there was a lot more that we could have done.
Oh, I guarantee you there was more you could have done, Padma. I moved from Virginia and my rates tripled. Don't even get me started on auto insurance.
Yeah,
We
well,
won't. Let's.
July 1st, our auto insurance rates are supposed to go down. But the bill that we passed was negotiated with the understanding that we would get certain things. It was a negotiation. It was supposed to be a compromise.
Sure.
But we got cheated out of some of that.
Don't take this the wrong way, but I'll believe it when I see it. And when my bill actually goes down, I'll believe it.
What
Until
my
then,
husband tells me every day.
yeah. Until then, until then, I don't believe a thing. But it is interesting. And of course, with auto insurance, I used to think the value of the car mattered, and now I realize that the only thing that matters is the cost of physical damage to people. Medical bills are what drives it, because I have a vehicle that's worth $2,000 and a vehicle that, a lease that's probably worth $30,000. The difference in paying for insuring those two vehicles with full coverage would be about the same. I mean, there's no difference significantly, and it's all about paying the medical bills.
One of the first things that we did do is most non-driving factors are not factored in starting July 1st. So
Right.
that I think is huge, because why should a person who is got no points on their driving license, but because they have a college education or have a higher credit score, get a lower rate?
And of course you're talking now, if this is only about me, I'm not so thrilled with that personally, because I have a feeling that some of those things might have benefited me in the past. But on the whole, those are good things for people, because we do need to make those differences and to even out that playing field a little bit. But
as a woman, I always look, because I'm a safe driver.
Yeah.
And I really think that women get the short end of the stick on this non-driving factor, just by virtue of the fact that I'm a woman. My rates should not be higher.
Yeah.
But that is one thing that we did a virtual town hall. You were talking about what are we doing during the pandemic. I've been doing a lot of virtual events.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to provide information. So myself and Representative Lori Stone from Macomb County, she's over in Warren on the other side of DeQuinder. She and I did a town hall together with the Department of Insurance and Financial Services on the changes. And we actually have that recording live on Facebook. So if anybody were to go watch.
I'll have to go find that and check it out.
Yeah, it was really good to have that.
I'm trying to get some unbiased answers to the changes coming July 1st, and I have a hard time trusting anything from any of the insurance agents I talk to. My apologies to the insurance agents, but I don't fully, although nobody really knows until the first hit. So
right.
Well,
go on the website, check them out.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for your work, and thank you for all that you do to help. And it sounds like very thoughtful responses to a lot of these issues. And I realize that, a friend of mine early on in ministry told me you're never going to get the whole pie. So decide how much you're satisfied with and accept, the portion that you're willing to get, which is part of the way laws happen and negotiations happen. And oftentimes, actually, it makes for a better bill if we can find middle ground in things. And the fringes sometimes are pushing things too far anyway. I do have one last question for you, and it's not a legislative question. It's simply this: where do you find joy?
That has been the hardest thing.
Yeah.
These last 3 months, responding to constituents' concerns, knowing that I spoke to a father who had not gotten his unemployment for 6 weeks, and that just the people who have small businesses who are worried about how they keep people on, because Yarn Store and Clausen, Sarah's Cake Supply in Troy, just all those little businesses, all those people. I have a constituent who is a gig worker. He performs at nursing homes, and those are the things. And I think that's where I'm really struggling and being able to take a day off. And so I'm actually taking the 28th Sunday off, my son's birthday. I figure I've parented a boy for 22 years who's now a man. I should celebrate that. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go for a walk in the woods, go for a walk at the beach or something like that. I think those are the things that.
And leave your phone in the car.
Right.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much, Representative Kuppa. I appreciate the time. It's great to work with you, and you are a gift to us. So thank you for all that you do and for your compassion and your heart.
Thank you.
Blessings to you.
Bye, Paul.